The clinking glasses of the 50th anniversary party fell silent. My brother, Daniel, stood on a crate of books. His slick suit, a stark contrast to the worn wooden floors of the winding page. For those unaware, he announced, his voice booming, the board has approved a final buyout. The offer stands at $400,000 for Henry's remaining shares. His eyes, cold and triumphant, locked onto mine. A gentle spring rain began to tap against the shop's tall windows. A sound I'd always found comforting, now a prelude to a storm. A ripple of mocking laughter came from the group of investors Daniel had brought with him. Men in short suits who had never cracked open a book that didn't have a balance sheet inside. "Generous, Danny," one of them called out. "More than the old place is worth." Daniel just grinned, a predator's smile. "I'm saving it," he mouthed to me across the room, the words a silent, cruel twist of the knife. He was making it clear to everyone. I had lost everything. His lawyer, a shark named Peterson, stepped forward and slapped the thick document onto the checkout counter. "Standard acquisition contract, Henry. All you have to do is sign." The sum, $400,000, was circled in red ink, a number meant to look substantial but which was a pittance for 50 years of my life. My loyal clerk, a young woman named Clara, looked at me with tears in her eyes. The old regulars, my friends, stood frozen in disbelief. I was completely and utterly cornered in my own home. But I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, I folded my hands behind my back, feeling the familiar texture of the dusty book I'd tucked into my waistband. I let a small, calm smile touch my lips. The sight of it seemed to unsettle Daniel more than any outburst would have. I met his gaze, holding it steady as the murmurs in the room died down. "400,000, Daniel? Is that really your final, legally binding offer?" My voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a razor. The air crackled. Daniel's smugness wavered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He glanced at his lawyer, who gave a dismissive shrug. Confidence flooded back into his face. "It is," he snarled. "Sign it or we'll see you in court, and you'll get nothing." The moment stretched, thick with anticipation. Everyone leaned in, expecting my surrender or my defeat. They were about to get their show. But months earlier, it all began on a Tuesday morning, with the scent of old paper and dust. That Tuesday, the apartment above my beloved bookstore was quiet, filled with the gentle morning light filtering through the old wavy glass. I was nursing a cup of tea, the familiar weight of a leather-bound first edition in my lap. The winding page wasn't just my business, it was my life, the legacy my father and I had built. The chiming of the shop's bell below was a sound as steady as my own heartbeat. Then I heard a second, more aggressive chime, and I knew my brother had arrived. Daniel came up the stairs 2 at a time, smelling of expensive cologne and impatience. He didn't look at the books. He looked at the space between them. "Henry, this place is a museum," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "We're hemorrhaging money. No online presence, no cafe, no synergy." He used these corporate words like weapons. He saw the store not as a sanctuary of stories, but as an underperforming asset. His visits had become more frequent, his tone more grating. Later that week, I was in our father's old office, a small dusty room I rarely used. I was trying to clear some space, feeling Daniel's words gnawing at me. My hand fell upon a heavy, leather-bound book, with no title on its spine, sitting on the highest shelf. It was one of my father's old law books from his university days. I ran my thumb over the cracked leather, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. It felt solid, a piece of him left behind, a comfort. Daniel walked in without knocking, holding a tablet. He saw the book in my hands and scoffed. "What is that old relic? For God's sake, Henry, this is what I'm talking about. You cling to junk." He tapped the book with a manicured finger. "This thing is worthless. Throw it out. It's just taking up space we could use for inventory management." He turned back to his tablet, already moving on, dismissing the book and, by extension, our father's memory without a second thought. The next Monday, Two men in crisp suits arrived. Daniel introduced them as efficiency consultants. They walked through the aisles with clipboards, their sterile presence an affront to the store's cozy chaos. They spoke in low tones to my brother, pointing at the worn armchairs where customers read for hours, at the children's corner Sarah had designed, at the shelves I'd built by hand. Each pointed finger felt like a personal accusation, a judgment against my life's work. The humiliation had begun. Their report came a week later. Underutilized floor space, outdated inventory system, excessive sentimentality in business model. Daniel presented it to me not as a suggestion, but as an indictment. Henry is running this place into the ground with his old-fashioned ideas, he told one of them on the phone, not bothering to lower his voice. I'm saving it. He truly believed it. He thought his greed was a form of salvation, and my love for our legacy was a terminal illness. That night, I couldn't sleep. The smell of old books, usually a comfort, felt like the smell of decay. I remembered being boys, maybe 10 and 12, stacking shelves after a big delivery. Stacking shelves with Daniel when we were just boys, dreaming of running the store together. We'll have the best shop in the whole city, Henry, he'd said, his face smudged with dust. People will come from all over. Now he was the one bringing the wrecking ball. 2 weeks later, Daniel called a formal meeting. It wasn't a discussion. It was a declaration. He presented a buyout offer. $150,000. It's a gift, Henry, he said, his expression utterly serious. The business is technically insolvent. This is me being a good brother. I looked at the number on the paper, an amount that wouldn't even cover the value of the rare book collection in the locked case behind him. It was the first time I realized this wasn't about business. It was about erasure. When I refused, he'd crop the bomb. It doesn't matter if you refuse. I control 51% of the partnership shares. I was stunned. Our father had left us the store 50-50. How? I stammered. He explained with chilling patience how he'd used a series of obscure financial maneuvers over the years, buying out fractional shares from a long-forgotten investment trust our father had set up. He had been planning this for years. A slow, silent coup. I spent the next few days in a daze, searching frantically through old files for any document that could help me. I found an old, typed letter from Dad, tucked inside a book of poetry. Protect the legacy, boys, it read. The future of the winding page is secured. It's all in the founding documents. But that was it. No details, no location. The founding documents were nowhere to be found. It was a breadcrumb leading to a dead end, a flicker of hope that only made the darkness deeper. Desperate, I made an appointment with George Abernathy, a local lawyer who'd known my father. He was a kind, aging man with a cluttered office that smelled of lemon polish and stale coffee. He listened patiently as I laid out my story, his brow furrowed with sympathy. Let me look into the partnership records, Henry, he said, patting my hand. Daniel is aggressive, but the law has to be followed. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of optimism. The feeling didn't last. Abernathy called me back 2 days later, his voice heavy with defeat. I'm sorry, Henry. If ironclad, the way Daniel acquired those shares, it's all technically legal. Aggressive, predatory even, but legal. He sighed. His lawyers are top tier. They've covered every angle. Honestly, my best advice is to take whatever offer he gives you and walk away. Fighting this will only drain your savings and leave you with nothing. The hope was brutally snatched away. That night, I sat in my father's office again, the silence of the bookstore below pressing in on me. My gaze fell on the dusty, leather-bound law book Daniel had called worthless. I picked it up, its weight a familiar burden. It felt like a symbol of everything I'd lost, my father's legacy, my brother's love, my own future. It represented a world of rules and laws that were now being used to crush me. I held it close, the worn leather cool against my cheek, feeling utterly defeated. I almost put it back on the shelf, but something my late wife Sarah used to say echoed in my mind. Your father never did anything by half, Henry. He always had a backup for the backup. She had admired his meticulous, sometimes maddeningly precise nature. I looked at the book again. not as a sentimental object, but as something my father, a man who planned everything, had kept for a reason. Why this specific book among hundreds of others he'd owned? My fingers, stiff with age, traced the spine. There was a slight bulge near the bottom, almost imperceptible. A flaw in the binding, perhaps. But as I ran my nail over it, I felt a seam. My heart began to beat a little faster. It wasn't part of the book. It was an insert. With trembling hands, I worked at the edge of the leather, slowly, carefully, prying it away from the cardboard beneath. It took 10 minutes, but finally, the spine cover came loose in my hand. Tucked inside the hollowed-out spine was a slim, folded bundle of onion skin paper, yellowed with age. It was brittle, and I handled it as if it were a priceless manuscript. As I unfolded it, I saw my father's precise architectural handwriting. The header read, "Addendum to the Partnership Agreement of the Winding Page, March 12, 1973. My breath caught in my throat. These were the real founding documents, the ones Daniel had never seen, the ones my father had hidden. My eyes scanned the dense legal text, my mind struggling to keep up. Then I saw it, a section titled Clause 7B, Hostile Action Provision. I read it once, then twice, my heart pounding against my ribs. It was a poison pill forbidden. It stated, in unambiguous terms, that if any partner attempted a hostile takeover, defined as acquiring a majority share without the other partner's written consent, the defending partner had the right to invoke an arbitration clause. And here with the genius of my father's design, the arbitration wasn't to determine a fair market price. The clause was brutally specific. The defending partner had the right to buy out the aggressor's total shares at their original 1973 valuation, not adjusted for inflation. The price my father and his initial investor had paid for the storefront 50 years ago. A number so laughably small, it was essentially nothing. Daniel hadn't just given me a shield. He handed me a sword. The next morning, Daniel cornered me by the history section. He was done playing games. "I've had it, Henry. My investors are getting antsy. I'm making one final offer, $400,000. You have a 24-hour deadline to accept it. Sign the papers I'm having delivered this afternoon, or my lawyers will begin forced liquidation proceedings. You'll be out on the street and I'll pick up the pieces from the rubble." His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. I met his cold gaze and felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. The fear and despair of the past few months had vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I had the book. I had the clause. "I'll consider your offer, Daniel," I said, my voice even. He took my quiet compliance for surrender. He smirked, a final, arrogant dismissal. "You do that," he said, and walked away. He had no idea he wasn't setting a deadline for my defeat, but a timetable for his own. The courier arrived at 3 p.m. sharp, a young man oblivious to the drama contained in his satchel. He handed me the thick envelope from Daniel's law firm. Inside was the acquisition contract, 80 pages of dense legalese designed to intimidate and overwhelm. I didn't even skim it. Instead, I placed it on the counter next to the cash register and went about my day, dusting shelves, recommending novels to regulars, and watering the fern Sarah had insisted on keeping by the front window. Around 5 p.m., Clara, my clerk, approached me, her face etched with worry. "Mr. Evans, are you really going to sign it? Is there nothing we can do?" She had been with me for 5 years, and she loved the store as if it were her own. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "Clara, some stories have a twist in the final chapter. Don't worry about me. Just make sure the champagne for the anniversary party tomorrow is chilled." Her confusion was palpable, but she nodded. That night, instead of poring over the contract of my surrender, I was on the phone with Abernathy. I read him Clause 7B. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Then a low whistle. "My God, Henry," he finally breathed. "Your father was a chess master. This isn't just a defense, it's a complete reversal. It's perfectly legal, perfectly binding." And Daniel walked right into it. His voice, once full of pity, now buzzed with a lawyer's thrill for the fight. Abernathy laid out the plan with cold, calculated precision. We don't warn him. We let him make his move publicly. His offer at the party tomorrow will be his legally binding act of hostile takeover. Once he does that in front of witnesses, you invoke the arbitration clause. His own contract will become the evidence against him. He's built his own gallows, Henry. All you have to do is pull the lever. The path was clear, and it was paved with my brother's arrogance. The day of the 50th anniversary party arrived. It was a strange, surreal affair. Daniel had invited his own guests, investors, real estate developers, who mingled awkwardly with my loyal customers. The new faction surveyed the store like vultures, whispering about renovations and profit margins, while my friends huddled together, casting sad, sympathetic glances my way. The air was thick with the tension of two worlds colliding, one of finance, the other of literature. The gentle spring rain tapping on the windows seemed to mourn the store's passing. I moved through the crowd, a ghost at my own wake. I overheard a hushed conversation in the store's back office between Daniel and one of his partners. "He's a sentimental old fool," Daniel was saying, the sound of ice clinking in his glass. "He'll sign. What choice does he have? By this time next month, we'll have gutted this place. It'll be a flagship cafe, maybe a co-working space." The raw, undisguised greed in his voice was chilling. He wasn't just taking my store. He was salivating at the thought of its destruction. The betrayal felt deeper than ever. This wasn't just a business disagreement. It was a fundamental violation of our shared history. I remembered him as a boy, hiding in these very aisles, reading adventure stories by flashlight long after closing time. He had loved this place once. Or perhaps he'd only loved the idea of owning it, and I was just the final obstacle to be cleared away. That thought hurt more than the loss of the money. Just before 7 p.m., Daniel's lawyer, Peterson, found me by the poetry section. He had a smug, predatory look in his eyes. "Ready to do the sensible thing, Henry?" he asked, tapping his briefcase. "Daniel is about to make his announcement. It would be much less embarrassing for you if you signed beforehand. A quiet, dignified exit." He was offering me a chance to avoid public humiliation, a final, condescending act of mercy that was, in itself, an insult. I just smiled. "I think I'll wait for the announcement," I said. "It feels like a historic moment, don't you think? 50 years. It deserves a little drama." Peterson shrugged, baffled by my calm. "Suit yourself. Don't say I didn't warn you." He walked away to join Daniel near the front of the store, where a small, makeshift stage had been set up. The trap was about to be sprung, and the bait was my apparent helplessness. And that's when Daniel climbed onto the crate of books, his voice silencing the room. He gave his speech, full of false sentiment about preserving a legacy while modernizing it. He spoke of new beginnings and tough decisions, and then he made his grand public declaration, the final, non-negotiable buyout offer of $400,000 for my shares, the climax of his long-planned conquest, delivered in front of everyone I knew. He held up the contract, a symbol of my defeat. The room was a tapestry of reactions. Daniel's investors looked pleased. My friends looked heartbroken, and Clara lived like she was about to burst into tears. My brother's eyes were locked on me, waiting for me to crumble, to protest, to beg. He wanted to show. He wanted to see me broken. It was the final, arrogant insult, delivered on the most public stage imaginable. He had no idea he was playing his part in a script he had never read. I let the silence hang for a moment longer. Then I calmly asked my question. "400,000, Daniel? Is that really your final, legally binding offer?" The question itself, so devoid of emotion, was the trigger. His confidence was absolute. "It is," he snarled, confirming his hostile action in front of more than 30 witnesses. And with those two words, he sealed his fate. He had just officially declared war, unaware that he had already lost. I reached behind my back and pulled out my father's dusty, leather-bound law book. I held it up. A murmur went through the crowd. Daniel rolled his eyes. "Oh, for God's sake, Henry, not that piece of junk again." Are you going to read me a bedtime story? His investors chuckled. They saw a senile old man clinging to a worthless trinket. They couldn't have been more wrong. This wasn't a storybook. It was a book of judgment. I walked forward, placing the book on the counter next to his 80-page contract. This book isn't junk, Daniel. It's our father's legacy. A legacy you clearly never took the time to understand. I carefully opened the book, and from its hollowed spine, I produced the yellowed, folded onion skin paper. I unfolded it with deliberate care, the brittle paper rustling in the now silent room. Peterson, the lawyer, leaned forward, a flicker of professional curiosity in his eyes. This, I announced, my voice steady and clear, is the original, notarized addendum to the partnership agreement. The one Dad put in place to protect the store from exactly this kind of predatory action. I held it up for all to see. It contains Clause 7B, the hostile action provision. Daniel's face, for the first time, registered a genuine shock. The word hostile hung in the air like a guillotine. Peterson snatched the document from my hand. His eyes flew across the page, his smug expression melting away, replaced by a mask of disbelief, then horror. He looked up at Daniel, his face pale. He's not bluffing, Peterson whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. It's real. It's a poison pill. Daniel stared at him, his mind refusing to process the words. What does that mean? I answered for him, my voice ringing with the clarity of long overdue justice. It means, brother, that by making a public, hostile offer to acquire a majority stake, you have triggered this clause. And this clause gives me the right to buy out your 51% share of the winding page. I paused, letting the words sink in, watching the color drain from Daniel's face. The hunter was now the prey. One of Daniel's investors, a portly man with a red face, blurted out, "At what price? He can't afford market value." The question was laced with panic. All their predatory dreams were evaporating. I smiled, a cold, thin smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Oh, I can afford it," I said, "because the price isn't set by the market. The price is set right here in this document. The original 1973 valuation." Abernathy, who had slipped in unnoticed at the back of the store, now stepped forward, holding a cashier's check. The total 1973 valuation for a 51% share, he announced to the stunned room, comes to $12,500. He placed the check on the counter. The number was so small, so absurdly, devastatingly small, that a few people gasped. $12,500 for a property worth millions. Daniel stared at the check as if it were a snake. He looked from the check to my face, his eyes wild with disbelief and rage. "No," he stammered. "No, this is insane. It's a trick. It won't hold up in court." Peterson put a hand on his arm. "It will, Daniel," the lawyer said, his voice a dead monotone. "It's a perfectly executed contractual maneuver. We're done." The finality of his lawyer's voice broke something in my brother. He lunged for the addendum, his face a mask of fury. "You senile old fool, you think you can steal this from me?" But Abernathy was quicker, snatching the document away. I stood my ground, unflinching. "You were the one who tried to steal it, Daniel. You just weren't smart enough to read the fine print. You dismissed our father's wisdom as junk." The irony was bitter, and it was beautiful. The atmosphere in the store had shifted completely. The mocking laughter was gone, replaced by shocked silence. My friends, the regulars, were looking at me with a mixture of awe and dawning joy. Clara was openly weeping, but this time her tears were of relief. Daniel's investors were already backing away, whispering into their phones, distancing themselves from a deal that had just spectacularly imploded. The vultures were fleeing the scene. Daniel stood trembling. His empire of greed, built on a foundation of sand, now washed away by a tide from the past. He had leveraged everything for this takeover. Losing his shares for a pittance would not just cost him the store, it would likely ruin him financially. He had flown too close to the sun, and our father's old, dusty law book was the rock upon which he had crashed. I turned to Abernathy. "Please invoke the arbitration clause immediately," I said, my voice formal. and inform Mr. Peterson that his client has 24 hours to accept the certified check and sign over the shares, or we will pursue immediate legal enforcement of the contract. I looked back at my brother, who was now just a shell-shocked man in an expensive suit. The same deadline you gave me, Daniel. It seems only fair. He didn't respond. He simply stared at me, his face a canvas of shattered pride and dawning horror. The man who had been master of the universe 5 minutes ago was now utterly powerless. The gentle rain still tapped against the windows, but now it sounded like quiet applause. The party wasn't over, it was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, the winding page was truly, completely, and indisputably mine. Daniel tried to speak, but no words came out. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish gasping for air. Peterson, the lawyer, was already snapping his briefcase shut. "Come on, Daniel," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "There's nothing more to do here tonight. We need to get back to the office and assess the damage." He was abandoning ship. The investors had already reached the door, their backs turned to the man they had toasted just minutes ago. The silence in the shop was broken by a sound I hadn't heard in months: Clara's genuine laughter. It started as a sob of relief and turned into a cheer. My regulars started clapping, a slow, swelling applause that filled the space where Daniel's arrogance had been. It wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for the place they loved. The warm smell of old paper and coffee seemed to push back the scent of expensive cologne and corporate greed. Abernathy stepped up to the counter, placing a heavy fountain pen next to the cashier's check for $12,500. He looked at Peterson. "I'll have the formal transfer papers drawn up within the hour. You can have your client sign them at my office first thing in the morning." He wasn't asking. He was instructing. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. The shark lawyer could only nod, his face grim. They had been outmaneuvered by a piece of paper from 1973. Daniel finally stepped down from the crate. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at me. His eyes were red, but not with tears, with pure, distilled hatred. "You set me up," he hissed, low enough so only I could hear. "You let me overextend. You let me borrow against my own shares to force this buyout. You knew this would ruin me." He still saw himself as the victim. "I'm saving it," he'd said. He never understood I was the one doing the saving. I met his gaze without blinking. "I didn't plan your greed, Daniel. I didn't force you to initiate a hostile takeover in front of 50 witnesses. You activated the clause yourself. You were so busy looking at the price tag, you never bothered to read the owner's manual." I picked up the law book from the counter. "Dad left us both this legacy. You chose to try and sell it for parts. Don't blame the machine when it defends itself." Peterson took Daniel by the elbow, practically dragging him toward the door. As they passed the threshold, Daniel turned for one last look. It wasn't regret in his eyes. It was the shock of a man who had just discovered the world didn't operate according to his rules. The bell above the door chimed as they exited. Not the aggressive chime of his arrival months ago, but a soft, final sound. He was gone. The party resumed, but with a different energy. It was no longer a wake for the winding page. It was a celebration of its survival. Clara popped the champagne cork, the sound echoing off the high shelves. "To another 50 years, she toasted, handing me a glass. The investors' empty glasses and discarded hors d'oeuvres were still on the tables, the only remaining evidence of the invasion, but had almost succeeded. We began to clear them away. I took the leather-bound law book and the precious addendum back upstairs to my apartment. I placed the paper back into the hollowed spine, pressing the worn leather cover back into place. It looked just as it had when it sat on the shelf, dusty and unassuming. Daniel had called it a worthless relic. It had just saved everything I owned. I placed it back on the shelf in my father's office, exactly where I had found it. The next morning, I was in Abernathy's office. Peterson arrived alone. Daniel couldn't face me. The transfer documents were signed without a word. The $12,500 check was accepted. It was done. With a few strokes of a pen, my brother's 51% share was transferred back to me. He was bought out, completely removed from the partnership, for less than the cost of the catering for his failed victory party. Abernathy told me that Daniel was facing lawsuits from his own investors. He had guaranteed them a quick return on the bookstore's redevelopment, leveraging assets he no longer controlled. His empire had collapsed overnight. It was the ultimate deepening of his betrayal. He hadn't just tried to destroy me. He had dragged others down with him in his blind pursuit of profit. He had been willing to destroy his family. And in the end, his greed had destroyed him. I walked back to the store. It was a Saturday, and the usual crowd was filtering in. The for sale sign Daniel had prematurely ordered for the building next door was being taken down by a confused work crew. I unlocked the front door of the winding page. The familiar scent of old paper, dust, and coffee greeted me. It smelled exactly the same as it always had, but today it felt different. It felt secure. I went to the back office. On the desk was the tablet Daniel had left behind in his haste the night before, the one he used to show me his efficiency models and dismiss our father's books. I picked it up. It was sleek, cold, and completely out of place. I opened the bottom drawer of the old oak desk and dropped the tablet inside, burying it under a stack of handwritten inventory logs. I walked over to the children's corner. Sunlight was streaming in, illuminating the colorful murals Sarah had painted 30 years ago. She had always told me that this place was more than just a business. It was a community. "Hold on to what matters, Henry," she would say. I ran my hand over the painted wall. I had held on. I had protected what she and my father had built. A bell above the door chimed again. A young couple walked in, holding hands, looking around with wide eyes. "Wow," the woman said. "It's like stepping back in time. It's perfect." They weren't efficiency consultants. They weren't investors. They were just people looking for stories. They were exactly who this place was built for. I smiled and stepped out from behind the counter to greet them. Clara came up to me holding the 80-page acquisition contract Daniel had left on the counter. The one I had refused to sign. The one that offered me $400,000 to disappear. "What should I do with this, Mr. Evans? Shred it?" I looked at the thick stack of paper, the monument to my brother's failed ambition. "No," I said, taking it from her. "Keep it. File it under fiction." The day passed in a blur of customers and congratulations. Word had spread among the regulars about what happened at the party. They didn't ask for details, but they shook my hand a little longer, their smiles a little brighter. The threat that had hung over us for months, the 24-hour deadline to accept the buyout or be forced out, had evaporated. The store was safe. I was safe. But there was one last thing left to do to make it official. That evening, Abernathy messaged me. The new deed was filed with the city registry. The winding page was now registered under a sole proprietorship, just as it had been when my father first started. The complex web of fractional shares and holding companies Daniel had constructed had been dissolved, cut through by the sharp edge of Clause 7B. The ownership was simple, clean, and absolute. It was 9 p.m., closing time. I went through the usual routine, locking the cash register, turning off the aisle lights one by one. The store fell into a comfortable shadow. I walked to the front window and looked out at the street. The rain had stopped. The street lights reflected on the wet pavement. For the first time in a year, I didn't dread what the next day would bring. I saw the large, professionally printed sign Daniel had forced me to put in the window last week. "Under new management soon." It was an advertisement for my own eviction, a daily humiliation he had insisted upon to show everyone who was in charge. It was taped securely to the inside of the glass, blocking the view of the display Sarah had always taken such pride in. I reached up and grabbed the corner of the sign. The tape resisted for a moment, then gave way with a loud rip. I pulled the sign down, crumpled the glossy paper into a tight ball in my fist, and tossed it into the waste bin. I turned the lock on the front door, the heavy steel bolt sliding home with a definitive clack.